Okay, so we're continuing with important terms for the class. And you can think of it in terms of the title of the class, US Latino History and Culture. So in the last class, I talked about the US and Latino terminology. Today, I talk about history and culture and race. And so it's a continuation of important terms for the class. I'm a historian, and so I'd like for you to get a little better understanding about history conceptually. Now, the first bullet point, that history is the study of the surviving evidence and sources about the past. The point of it is to remind us that we don't have the history. We don't have direct access to history to study it. I can't go in the past and take pictures or do interviews or, bring documents with me. So when we learn about the past, when we study the past, all we can study is what is left behind from the past, the surviving evidence. Now, this also means that historically, there's been a bias in the way that history is written, because only the wealthy or powerful are the ones whose records survived in order for us to study them. And so here again, we don't study the past, we study what's left behind, the surviving evidence. All right, next bullet point is an account of change over time. It might be one of the most common definitions of history, if you ask a historian. And it kind of means that the one constant in history is change. If there wasn't change over time, then it'd kind of be pointless to point out the difference between 1900 and the year 2000. If you told one story, you'd tell it all. But that isn't the case. History is about change over time. Third bullet point is for us to become aware, cognizant of the fact that the most common way in which we study history is with this literary tool of storytelling, of having a narrative. Okay, what's the significance in that? Well, if we're aware of how that is a literary tool, then it becomes easier for us to be aware of its limitations. Meaning, let's say someone wrote a history of the year 2024. We were all there, but none of us lived our life with the goal of fitting into some historian's narrative of what it was like to live in 2024. We all have different experiences. If we were able to do this, a more effective way of telling history would be to have everyone's narratives. But we don't have the ability to do that. And so the way we typically tell history is kind of confined by this practice of us trying to put things into a story. But not everything can fit into a convenient story. Last bullet point, warning. Facts are explained with words to connect them and give them meaning. This allows for the interpretation and possible distortion of past incidents. What do I mean? What does this mean? Sometimes people might say, just give me the facts, and I'll come to my own conclusions. And that's good. That's not a bad approach. You should always be thinking for yourself and, determining whether you agree with something or not. But even if a historian were to just give you the facts, they could not give you all the facts. Someone always has to pick what facts they think are the ones that are most important. So inevitably, there is always a degree of interpretation based on who the author, who the historian is. And so, yeah, and facts don't speak for themselves. I can give you a number, but someone needs to tell you what the number means and contextualize it so that you know the significance of the number or numbers. What is history about? It used to be that history would focus exclusively on things like war, politics, and the quote unquote great men who were rich or powerful. Now, historians recognize that everything has a history and that common people are important too. This makes me think of medieval Europe as a good example, where when we think of medieval Europe, you know, it's easy to think of kings, queens, you know, princesses, knights in shining armor, you know, just nobility in general, you know, priests and friars. But all those categories of people I just mentioned would have made up less than 10% of the European population during medieval times. Yet that's what we think of, and that's what we learn about if we learn the history of that time and place. And it's excluding 90% of the population. So again, you know, part of it is that those are the people who left behind sources for us to read, back to that previous slide. But now we try to be aware of that big omission that we're doing when we only focus on those groups. We're missing the overwhelming majority of the population. So now, you know, we focus on anything, everything, especially the majority of people. And so now we also look at, say, the history of everyday life, history of technology, history of ideas, gender history, art history, cultural history. Not just wars and the rich and powerful. I like this. It says history is who we are and why we are the way we are. History is not just the past, history is the present. It's easy for us to, when we think of history, to think of something in the distant past that doesn't have a lot of relevance for us today. But history is actually what explains us right now at this very moment in this very classroom. It explains why I'm speaking to you in English, why I'm the one standing up here and you're the one sitting there, why everything, you know, about what language you speak, what your name is, you know, how you got the personal objects you brought with you. It's all explained by history. History is with us right now. It is not just a disconnected, distant past that has no relevance for us right now. Now I'm going to talk about the way we learn, the way we're taught history in K through 12 education, especially in public schools. And most of this information, these first 3 bullet points, come from the 4th bullet point, from a book by James Loewen called Lies My Teacher Told Me. There's one chapter that he devotes to this topic. And so Loewen brings up one factor being school boards. The members of school boards for school districts who decide what history books are going to be taught in high schools, they are overwhelmingly not historians. So there's that. And, you know, be unfair to expect them to be, but yet noteworthy to point it out. They're also elected officials. So they, it is common for them to pick books that their constituents, the voters, are not going to complain about. Especially if they want to be reelected and remain on the board. And so the result has turned out to be a history of the US that is all about how awesome we've been and we only keep getting better. And that no one's going to complain about. School boards connected to the next bullet point, publishers. When publishers are trying to sell books to the board members for them to pick them for their school district, they sell it to them based on the bells and whistles, not based on the fact whether their books are the most accurate, have the most agreed upon viewpoints by professional historians with PhDs. No, they sell it to them based on the bells and whistles. Bells and whistles like, do they have a companion website? Is there a companion phone app or tablet app? You know, does it come with materials to help the teachers come up with quick exams or quizzes? The bells and whistles, not the content of the material that they're teaching. Another aspect with regard to publishers and connects to the next bullet point is that it makes financial sense. So publishers are businesses and they're going to come up with a way to make it the most convenient and cost-effective way for them to make the books. So they make their history books first for their largest market, and then they'll modify them as necessary for each state based on the standards that each state wants their students to learn. The largest market in the US is Texas. The problem with that is that Texas has a long history. I've been more familiar with it during the last 2 decades, when during the last 2 decades, pretty much every 2 to 3 years, there's a big controversy with what's it called? The Texas, I think it's the Texas Board of Education, that every 2 to 3 years, there's some big controversy about what they're trying to do. Examples of the things they've been trying to do in recent years. They tried to get rid of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from history. They got rid of Cesar Chavez, the most well-known Mexican-American civil rights leader from the time period of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They tried to change the way that slavery is described in their textbooks so that they would be treated with the same language that immigrants are portrayed in history, not slaves and slavery in their treatment. It's essentially a whitewashing of US history, trying to minimize those things that that people might be more critical about US history. And so yeah, these are some of the issues with the way that history is taught in K through 12 education, and the way that then people, you know, kind of want it to continue to be told throughout the rest of their lives in the general public. I also want to introduce you to this concept of historiography. Usually it's only historians that are familiar with historiography. Some other majors or disciplines are better about teaching this kind of thing to their students. So you guys might be more familiar with this as a literature review. So it's similar to a literature review, but historiography is a history of how a topic of history has changed over time. And so an example would be, let's say, for example, we're thinking about the history of the Civil War. We might think, well, the Civil War happened, like 160 years ago. So nothing has changed, right? It happened 100 whatever years ago. What happened. Nothing changes about how the Civil War took place. So therefore, the way the history is told about the Civil War doesn't need to change and doesn't change. But that's not the case. If we read the way that history books have covered the Civil War, say in 1880, 1900, 1940, year 2000, 2020, we find that even though the historians say, I'm just giving it to you the way I see it, I am being objective as could possibly be. I'm just telling you what I learned after 20 years of studying this topic. What we learn is that despite all of those claims, historians have been unable to not be influenced by the time and place in which they lived in the way that they recount the history of the Civil War. Whatever happened in the 1860s happened, and that hasn't changed, but the way we remember it does change over time. What's an example of that, if you're not familiar? One example of that would be before the 1960s, most people believed, or the way historians told the story is that the main issue that resulted in the Civil War was states' rights. Since the 1960s, now 99% of professional historians agree that the most important issue that led to the Civil War was the institution of slavery, not states' rights. And so that's just one example of how it has changed. So that was history. Now we move on to culture. I'm going to introduce you to 3 different ways of thinking about culture. And ultimately, I'm going to encourage you to subscribe to the 3rd way of thinking about culture. The first one is the historically traditional way of thinking about culture. And another way of describing it is this idea of high culture. You're believed to be cultured if you were educated in European history, European art, and arts including music. And so in order to be cultured, you needed to be knowledgeable in specific things associated with Europe. That could also include, like etiquette even. In more recent decades, the way that people popularly talk about culture is associating it with different ethnic groups or different foreign groups. And so we might think of like Chinese culture, or I don't know, Viking culture, or whatever, just Italian culture, Roman culture. We think of different groups, especially foreign groups. And unfortunately, one of the things that's implied there, even though it's not explicitly stated, is this idea that if you're a US citizen, a white US citizen, without knowledge of any foreign background, then there's this implication that you don't have culture. When you think of culture, you think of people that are different from the norm. If you're normal, just a normal American, you don't have culture, and that's not true. Everybody has culture. It's not just people that are foreign. And that leads us to the third way of thinking. This third way does come from academic sources, people who studied culture in academia in the past. And they would argue that culture is about a way of thinking, is about the way you live or your lifestyle. Another way of saying it is that culture is the way you think, act, and interact. I was trying to think of so when I think of this, I think in an old school way about computers, where people used to talk about, there's the hardware, the computer, and then there's the software, kind of the programming. But now that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now we might still think of the computer or the device, but then we might think maybe operating system like Apple or Android, or we might think of the apps, sort of what you do with the hardware, can vary a lot based on what apps you're using. You don't have to write all this down, but I do want to emphasize that language. I would argue that language is one of the most important aspects of culture, because a lot of what we know and what we are able to learn is limited by the languages that we speak. Sometimes we don't realize how by not learning other languages and their cultures, that we're limited to how much we can learn about culture. For some of you that have learned other languages, at some point you start realizing that it's helpful to understand the culture and not just the language in order to make sense of the language. Because when you just translate words, it doesn't work. And not to mention that in one language, a word might have a certain association or connotation, and in another language, it might have a very different association or connotation. And so even though you're just translating the word, it can mean different things. Or it can mean different things to people, even though you're using the same word. They can interpret it differently. So yes, language is one of the most important. Moving on to race, and I'm not going to have you answer this in a sheet of paper. I just want you to think about which of these questions you can easily answer for yourself, and which ones you might have a harder time answering for yourself. What is your race? What's your ethnicity? What is your nationality? What is your culture? What is your citizenship? What is your occupation? And no worries. And how do you identify? Would you look to one of these other questions to explain how you identify? Or is it something different altogether? It certainly could be. So these different things, race, ethnicity, nationality, culture, and citizenship, these are all terms that are used to describe different groups of people. But they are all socially constructed. None of these are biological, not even race or ethnicity. And I'll talk about that in a bit. I'll explain that. When we talk about race, we might use terms like white, black, Asian, or native. When we talk about ethnicity, we might use, some examples would be like Jewish or Latino. When we talk about nationality, we'll look to using the names of countries, nations, to help describe different people. Culture can be anything. There's a lot of subcultures, different cultures and subcultures. There's a lot of possibilities. Citizenship is political or legal affiliation. Now I'm going to introduce you to a few different explanations or definitions of race by different experts. This first one is by two sociologists. They wrote a book, I think it was called Racial Formations. And this is the definition that they give. So it was a whole book about the social construction of race. But this is one definition they give, and it's a very wordy academic definition, very theoretical, but I'll try to explain it. They say that race is a concept which signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. What does that mean? It's saying that these ideas of race are really about social conflict and interests. It's about people saying they and us, them and us. It's about social conflict and interests. And they make reference to these concepts of race and try to connect it to this idea that people have different types of human bodies. Here's another explanation from a historian with a historical approach. He says, racial categories have not always been defined by an empirical reality, but at times by a perceived reality. In other words, the racialization of an individual or group did not always correspond with skin pigmentation, but drew from dominant ideas about behavior, clothing, music, culture, and symbols. Because behavior and cultural expression could be altered and manipulated, there were moments when race categories became elastic and unstable because of the time, place, and context of the particular social dialogue between peoples. What does that mean? It means that from a historian's perspective, what people saw as racial groups changes over time and also changes based on place. So different concepts about race are different based on time and place. It's also saying that people had these ideas that if you're of a specific racial group, that means you dress a certain way, you listen to certain kind of music, you behave a certain way, and you're associated with certain symbols. It's almost this idea of stereotypes or caricatures of different racial groups. We just associate them with certain things. But we see that because it was based on these ideas of, if you're of this racial group, this is how you act, dress, and behave, then you see that people will change those symbols, that clothing, the way of speaking, their culture, to try to be included into a more advantageous racial category, for example. And so there could be an association with a racial category that has more privilege and disassociate from a racial group that is disadvantaged in a time and place in history. If this concept of the social construction of race is new to you, I highly recommend you go to this website. It's called understandingrace.org. It was created by the American Anthropological Association, and it has a lot of resources to help make sense of this idea of the social construction of race. I'm just curious, how many of you have been taught or have learned about the social construction of race before? Just a couple? Okay. In the other class, it was between a third and a half of students. So yes, definitely important. I'll continue explaining it. There's this other short video, 2.5 minutes, by the Smithsonian, with this idea of one species. Basically, it's this idea that when we look at human history, we learn that all humans came from the continent of Africa. And I think that was like between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. And so therefore we all are one species. We all came from the same place, and we all share the same species. A lot of the overwhelming majority of the same DNA and so forth. So races do not exist according to biology or genetics. The idea that race is a social construct means that it does not exist in biology or genetics. Here is an explanation from the people who created or worked in the Human Genome Program that mapped out the human DNA. And this is what they have to say about race. They say, DNA studies do not indicate that separate classifiable subspecies or races exist within modern humans. While different genes for physical traits such as skin and hair color can be identified between individuals, no consistent patterns of genes across the human genome exist to distinguish one race from another. There also is no genetic basis for divisions of human ethnicity. People who have lived in the same geographic region for many generations may have some alleles in common, but no allele will be found in all members of one population and in no members of any other. And so this is saying the people who mapped out the human genome are saying that they did not find any evidence of race being in our DNA. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't inherit your parents' genes and that you don't inherit certain phenotypes or traits that people associate with race, like skin color, hair texture, eye shape, etc. But you're inheriting those phenotypes. You're not inheriting anything that is race. And so, other academics have been arguing this for decades. But now we have, with the mapping out of the human genome, now we have DNA evidence of this idea as well. Before I get to this, I'll go over it and then talk about it. All right. So race is a social construction, not a biological reality. I already said that. It is a social construction based on phenotypes, based on people's appearance. But there is also a social reality based on that social construction. So that means that even though race is a social construct, it doesn't mean that it has not affected people's lives in very real ways, whether we're talking about the past or the present. So there's this paradox that race as we know it has no deterministic biological basis, yet all the same, race is so powerful that it has had in the past and it can have in the present life or death consequences.